Welcome. My name is Shuvaloy Majumdar. I'm the Foreign Policy Program Director at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and we are about to convene our webinar on the West has evacuated the land, but it must not abandon the women of Afghanistan. We do this in honor of International Women's Day 2022. Since the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan, the country's economy has all but collapsed, with most of the population now suffering from shortages of food, clean water, and shelter. Millions may die from starvation in the coming months, and all of Afghanistan is suffering. Yet Afghan women and girls are facing a particularly dire situation under the new Taliban regime. All the hard-won gains and civil liberties fought for by Afghan women over the past 20 years have disappeared almost overnight. Before the takeover, women made up over 20% of Afghanistan's workforce. Today, they're prevented from participating in public life, working, or pursuing education above a 6th grade level. After International Women's Day, the international community, including Canada, needs to take stock of what's happening to Afghan women and girls under the Taliban and find the moral courage to do something about it. When the brave people of Afghanistan languish under such terrible conditions, we should not settle for policies that are easy or expedient. To shed light on this issue, our institute is pleased to host some of the finest experts on this topic from Canada and abroad to discuss the plight of women in Afghanistan and what can be done about it. And to get us started, please cue the video.
شایعه آمدن طالبان به شهر کابل و حضور شماری از افراد مسلح در این شهر اوضاع این شهر را برهم زد.
Last night I dreamed of Afghanistan, fighting for freedom in a troubled land. The people were singing some ancient song. Where are they now? Where do they belong? Why must I cry these hidden tears? How can I go on throughout the years, endlessly searching to quell my fears? Glance of the refugee.
Thank you for that. The remarkable voice behind that video is a longtime foreign correspondent. She's served her country and its diplomacy in Canada and is now a real advocate for Afghan women. Khurshid Nusrati, we're delighted and honored to have you here, and thank you so much for sharing such a beautiful video and music to help us appreciate and connect with some of the issues that are associated here. Now, Khurshid, before we get started, I just wanted to ask you, you have a really compelling journey that I didn't do justice to. Tell me about you and your connection to Afghanistan, how you came to America and American journalism, but more importantly, how you feel about what's happening in Afghanistan today.
Thank you, Shu. It's great to be with you. Well, my connection to Afghanistan is that my father was from Afghanistan. My mom is American, so I'm half Afghan, half American. We call ourselves Afghans. And I was in New York City when 9/11 occurred. I was working for ABC News at the time, and that just completely changed my life. I think many of our lives were changed by that tragic those tragic incidents. But it brought me to Afghanistan. I'd never been there before. So I was able to travel with one of my aunts who was returning after 24 years. I was supposed to go for 2 weeks. I stayed for nearly 3 years. And first I worked for ABC News, doing as a producer and also a correspondent. And then I was hired by Fox News as their correspondent, and then became their bureau chief for nearly 2 years. But prior to that time, I'd been involved as an advocate to tell the story, to raise awareness for what was going on to Afghan women and girls under the Taliban in the late 90s. So my advocacy started before 9/11, and even before, as a younger girl, my father was very active when the Soviets rolled in the late 70s. So the advocacy had been there as a young girl, and being exposed to Afghan culture, of course, which is part of me, but more and more the politics that was behind it, and trying to understand why my father's homeland was going through such difficult times. So having the opportunity to go to Afghanistan and then cover it as a journalist, as a correspondent, but then really being able to connect with the Afghan women that were there, to see their struggles firsthand. It's one thing to know about it when you're thousands of miles away and be connected it through your heritage. Is another thing to actually experience it firsthand. So those years were incredible for me, both professionally, but more so I'd say personally, because it really connected me to the land and to the people. And so then I became very inspired to tell the stories of Afghan women and girls struggling, but also their blossoming, because those years were golden years in the early 2000s, when all opportunities seemed just possible. And there was just incredible energy and optimism during those years. I kind of call them the golden years of renewal for Afghanistan. And so much has transpired since then. A lot of good, incredible strides were accomplished and made during these last 20 plus years on behalf of Afghan women's rights and civil liberties. So I was very blessed and grateful that I was able to continue to tell that story. Once my ex-husband is the former Afghanistan ambassador to Canada and France. So we lived in Canada for 5 years in Ottawa. And that's where I had the opportunity then to step back from being a journalist, but still use those skills to be able to tell those stories and become a fierce advocate on behalf of Afghan women and girls throughout Canada, engaging with the media and speaking in a variety of events with the Parliament and with the Governor General and in various forum where I could try to shine light on what they were going through and the support that they needed. And at that time, Canada really opened its arms and its heart to Afghanistan. And I'm very grateful for that experience.
Thank you for that. And, as you speak, my friend, I think about your journey from the Soviet time that your father would have left Afghanistan, the cycle of violence that the country has endured, its promising revival, and now this crushing moment in history. You're an incredible storyteller, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So thank you very much for that. The next panelist I'm looking forward to introducing to you is a giant in Canadian policy, particularly when it comes to advocating for Afghan women. And Khurshid Nusrati and Dr. Lauren Oates co-published 2 days ago in the Globe and Mail an incredible opinion piece that I encourage you all to look at, describing the plight of Afghan women and how they must not be forgotten. It's on our website at www.Macdonald-Laurier.ca. But let me turn now to Dr. Oates. Lauren, it's nice to have you here. You are a fierce proponent for Afghan women. You have been for many years. Tell us how you came to connect with this Afghan story.
Sure. Very glad to, and glad for the opportunity to be here and talk about this issue during International Women's Month. So my story, I guess, starts around 1996 when the Taliban captured Kabul, and I was a 9th grader in Vancouver, and I was kind of on this justice beat and interested in issues of justice, or that's the story my mom has told me. And she cut out a newspaper article for me about the Taliban's capture of Kabul and the edicts they had imposed on women and girls. And I read this story about a place that, you know, I certainly couldn't find on a map at that time, that said that girls like me couldn't go to school there. And I was outraged. And I guess the context in which I sort of stumbled across Afghanistan made a huge difference in my life and my perspective on women's rights issues, because I became kind of immune to arguments I'd confront later in Canada, in the Western world, like cultural relativism, where people would tell me things like, you know, well, that's just their culture, or, you know, you might not like the Taliban, but that's something for Afghanistan, and who are we to impose our views on others? And I think I was immune to that because of being essentially a child when I heard this. I think youth are better at calling a spade, and I could see very clearly that this wasn't right. And I was certain that girls didn't like not being able to go to school, and women didn't like losing their rights. And I found out I was right later when I went to Afghanistan, and I met women and girls there. And I didn't have to tell them anything about human rights. They had a really inherent idea of their own dignity and the fact that their dignity was being violated, whether or not they knew about things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that made a big difference to me. And then I was finally able to go to Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. And I arrived in 2003, just at the time that the constitutional Loya Jirga was taking place, and saw Afghanistan's new constitution passed. It was a really exciting, optimistic time, the golden years, as Khurshid says. And I just kept going back, and I got addicted, and it became, not my second home, but my other home, and just kind of integrated with my life. And then suddenly a couple decades passed, and here we are with Taliban 2.0, which I think is actually just Taliban 1.0, but maybe with a superior marketing department. And I've now been on this beat, this women's rights beat for a couple decades, and I've had time in that period to try a few different tactics to get other people to sort of see things my way and to care about this issue. I tried moral persuasion to argue from a rights perspective, and assume that people who have rights, who live in places like Canada, would understand human rights well. But that hasn't always landed. It turns out that the people whose rights are reasonably well protected are not always convinced that others deserve the same. So after some time, I started more of trying this realpolitik approach, and I found that there were piles and piles of evidence at my disposal. If you just look at any heat map of where in the world there is violent conflict and instability, and then you look at any heat map of where in the world women's rights are the least upheld, those generally are the same places. And there's all kinds of other, glaring correlations too, where women lack rights. You will also find often endemic poverty and things like low literacy and high infant and child mortality and a host of other ills. So if we want to solve these problems, like insecurity, problems that affect us too, for example, in the form of the threat of terrorism, then we had better pay attention to the status of women and girls in the world. This showed me that feminism, as it turns out, is not just this, something for liberals and leftists, but it's really something for realists too. So there's now this opportunity to get a wider swath of people to really care about human rights catastrophes like the one we're witnessing in Afghanistan right now, in policy and practice, not just from the moral angle, but from this more pragmatic angle too. So I try to keep pushing both and shake down every tree I can, and try to stay optimistic throughout as well. So that's a bit about me and Afghanistan.
It's a pretty special story, Lauren, and your work at Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan is par excellence the best in the country in terms of advocating in realistic terms what Canadians can do to address the country, to address the challenges of Afghanistan. And I'm looking forward to having that discussion with you too. Thank you so much. What a great opening comment. The third woman that we have here, very strong journalist from Tolo, which is one of the biggest Afghan broadcasters, perhaps the largest watched one in the country as an independent news platform, is Anisa Shaheed. Anisa has recently come to North America from Afghanistan. She has had a harrowing experience in terms of navigating the threats that the Taliban posed more recently. But Anisa, before we get started, let me ask you, when you were a young girl, where did you grow up?
Thank you for create this meeting. I have always lived in Afghanistan every years. I studied and worked there. I was a journalist in Afghanistan for 13 years. Journalist in Afghanistan was hard work. It was dangerous, but I worked for the people. I worked for freedom and equality, the rights of the people. I wish people had a better future, but the Taliban captured Kabul and I had to leave Afghanistan. I think I lost everything. I'm going to have hard time. I have written dozens of reports on corruption, war, and peace, and human rights, especially women's rights. And we worked for a better future, but the situation got brought. And I think it's a, I think Afghan people very, very bad situation now. And world left Afghanistan, world left Afghan people. I don't know why.
Thank you for that. Powerful, powerful observation. But Anisa, let me ask you, did you grow up in Kabul?
What?
When you were a young girl, where did you grow up in Afghanistan?
I'm left Afghanistan in August, in 23 August.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. If Taliban captured Kabul, I left Afghanistan. I left Kabul
No, I understand.
without my family.
Can I just jump in, Shiv? I think in Dari, Anisa Jan, Kabul zindagi asti? Kabul zindagi kadi?
Yes, I all my life in Kabul. Yeah, I'm 34 years and I all life in Afghanistan. Yes.
How did you start working at Tolo in journalism?
I started December 2008. Yeah.
And did you always want to be a journalist?
Yes. All time I worked with Tolo News, with people, I make everyday reports about corruption, about human rights, about election, about war, about suicide attack, about rape for women, for child. And I wish one day I have better Afghanistan, better life.
Thank you very much, Anisa, and thank you for sharing how you have informed your country's debate. For those who may not be entirely familiar, Anisa Shaheed and Tolo News are a major Afghan news platform that connects people to the issues of their time and has shown remarkable bravery even after the Taliban takeover in covering the stories of ordinary Afghans and and the new Taliban, I would call it government loosely, that has been controlling the state. Thank you, Anisa Jan. Really nice to have you here, and looking forward to our conversation as well. Let me now turn to Khurshid on her impressions of what can the public do in North America and Canada to put pressure on our governments to more fairly engage with the Afghan refugee crisis. We see the world is afire in conflicts in many theaters right now, and the risk of Afghanistan being a forgotten story cannot be permitted. So I'll turn to you first. How do you think that the public in the West can be mobilized to hold governments accountable?
It's such an important question, and I grapple with it myself personally to really um, to try to see where we can put more pressure on our governments. I live in the United States, so I will talk about it more so in the U.S. context. I'm sure Lauren would be able to address it more in the Canadian context. But I mean, I feel that it takes a certain level of outrage to and unified outrage to be able to put pressure on the U.S. government to fulfill its obligations and its moral responsibility to help Afghan refugees and help Afghanistan. Yes, I don't think anyone thought that the United States would remain in Afghanistan in perpetuity, but the way it disengaged on August 15th is an absolute catastrophe. And that spun everything out of control and created a sense of urgency and panic and chaos and led to unnecessary deaths and tensions, pressures, and just tipped Afghanistan over the edge. It was already it already has a history of incredible suffering, unfortunately, as a very impoverished nation. But that coupled with drought and food shortages and ongoing political instability, and then the very dishonest and malicious activities and influences of our neighbors and the geopolitical influences have created such a massive catastrophe in Afghanistan. So it's ongoing. And so one of the things that has really been difficult for me right now is that Afghanistan continues to be one of the worst, if not the worst, humanitarian crisis in the world. Out of a population of nearly 40 million people, 22.8 million Afghans are now facing acute food shortages, with most of the population suffering. However, the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine has dominated the world's attention and absorbed the lion's share of media coverage, concern, and pledges for humanitarian assistance. So, just yesterday, the US government, the Congress and the Senate, passed a $13.6 billion emergency aid package for Ukraine. But a month ago, President Biden announced that half of the $7 billion that were frozen assets being held for Afghanistan would be split, with half of the funds going to the families of 9/11 victims and the other half being held for projects for Afghanistan, to help Afghanistan somewhere down the road. So to me, that is incredibly unjust. This injustice is just screaming out for all the world to see. And there's racism attached to it and bigotry in how the world has decided to react and help Ukraine versus how they have helped Afghanistan or Syria or Palestine or ... wherever you want to add which country in the world is suffering through. Because there's just, I think, inherent racism and bigotry in our government systems. And there's so much suffering around the world. We're living in an unprecedented time where the levels of humanitarian disaster are so high. I think it's difficult for our governments, let alone just the population of various countries to sustain support for more than one or two disasters that are going on at the same time. This is one of the difficulties. But right now, think about it, 23 million people plus in Afghanistan need aid. 13 million in Yemen are severely hungry. 15 million in Central Sahel in Africa are in need. 4 million in Somalia are drought affected, and the list goes on. So I think we have to unite in outrage. And right now, Ukraine is dominating the news cycle, and with good reason. It's an absolute catastrophe and tragedy that's unfolding in front of our eyes. But we cannot forget what's going on in Afghanistan. And their needs are real, and their needs are urgent. So I think we just have to be very focused in keeping our advocacy going, keeping our voices strong, writing op-eds, having speaking opportunities, this webinar. We have to be able to keep the public interested, but also to challenge our political leaders. I don't think that we have to be passive about it. I'm not advocating any kind of violence or anything. I'm just saying that we have to call our leaders out on some of these discrepancies, on the hypocrisy that exists in our governments and in legislation that's being passed. We have to challenge it because, for example, in the United States, there are lots of congressmen and women and senators who are very, very sympathetic to Afghanistan, who've traveled there, who know the situation is real. I think it's a balancing game as far as nobody wants to take support away from Ukraine or anywhere else, but right now Afghanistan has slipped into the shadows. So we have to keep pressure on those political contacts. We have to make sure that they don't forget Afghanistan.
Of course, thank you for that, because I think it's an incredible indictment that you've just provided, and I think correctly so. We have these conflicts around the world, but there's a tendency to look at them individually rather than collectively. One of the papers I'd encourage viewers to investigate at the Macdonald-Laurier.ca is a piece by former ambassador to Afghanistan, Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan, former deputy UNAMA head Chris Alexander, describing Pakistan's proxy war in Afghanistan. And set in the context of what has led to the reoccupation of Afghanistan is, to what Khurshid's point has been, is American retreat, particularly Biden's retreat from Afghanistan. The way that it was done certainly signaled to authoritarians around the world that a new era is upon us, and Pax Americana, the period of enduring peace that had been established prior to the events of 9/11 and the subsequent decades, has now come to an end. Without a doubt, it was a signal to authoritarians, whether the designers in the Kremlin or places in Beijing, that this was an opportunity for them to seize the advantage and to challenge the rules-based order, which is clearly linked to the events of Russia's invasion of Ukraine today. And so thank you very much for that sweeping comment, because I think that intervention really helped frame how important it is for us to walk and chew gum and to do multiple things at once. So Lauren, maybe I can turn to you now on that point, because I know you have a lot of thoughts about how we can engage on the Afghan issue, even in the context of what's happening in Ukraine. It is an incredibly important imperative. And to your earlier introductory point about women and peace and security, and to what Khurshid has just said, we have to change the way in which we think about practicing the craft of foreign policy. There's half the population in the world that usually pays the biggest price in the context of conflict, but can also be an incredibly important part of the solution in maintaining a peace. So Lauren, taking a step back, provide us your broader view here about what can be done in addressing the challenges that Khurshid has so wonderfully described.
Yeah, absolutely. And, before I turn to that, I just say, Ukraine and Afghanistan are the same fight. These are both fights for freedoms. They're both fights for democracy, for human rights. They're both cases where, an authoritarian regime seized power from a neighboring territory. In Ukraine's case, it was Russia. And in Afghanistan's case, it was Pakistan's ISI's, proxy Taliban taking power and stealing democracy. So I don't see this as a competition, one issue or the other. This is the same issue, but we have to challenge people to see it that way, and kind of open their empathy to include both, and see their own fates wrapped up in Afghans the way that it looks like it's easier for people to see with Ukrainians. So I have a lot to say on that issue, but yeah, I do want to talk about Canada's policy towards Afghanistan now, which obviously shifted significantly with events in August. Afghanistan was on the receiving end of I think the largest commitment in spending, certainly spending focused on gender specifically, of any country in the world. So there were a lot of programs running, and things very suddenly stopped. And Canada has this feminist international foreign policy, which the FIAP, and that's earned us a fair amount of reputation capital, you could say, internationally. But when Kabul fell in August, Canada effectively left Afghanistan. I mean, literally, like the embassy closed and programs stopped. And so now the entirety of our Afghanistan policy is, it appears, focused on the resettlement, the 40,000 Afghans that we've committed to. And even though that's the totality of our effort for responding to the Afghan crisis, there's still a lot of work to do, a lot of progress to be made on that front. But back to in Afghanistan, I actually understand and endorse the position of not engaging with the Taliban that the Canadian government has taken. But I insist that it's still entirely possible for Canada to provide transformational and lasting support to women and girls who are still in Afghanistan. And in fact, we have to find a way to do that. So our government needs to get creative and find ways to fund programs that support women and girls in Afghanistan. And FIAP, the Feminist International Foreign Policy, it's only worth its salt if it's actually applied in the places where it's needed. And at this moment, there is no place in the world where women and girls are less free than in Afghanistan. And there is no other country on the planet that has it as its official policy for girls not to go to school beyond grade 6. None, not another country. So if this isn't the place for FIAP, then where is? So as a Canadian, I, not only as an activist on this issue and as a representative of Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, but really just as a Canadian citizen and taxpayer, I want to see our foreign policy working on the hard problems. And this is a hard problem. And that's where we need to be. And I think it's possible to have policy that is both principled and political, that makes our country look good on the world stage, but which actually also changes people's lives and even saves lives. And that demands a really genuine long-term commitment to focus on hard problems and maybe a bit of a cultural change to work on things that are not convenient to work on. So I think FIAP has the potential to be that, but we need a total paradigm shift and to be willing to work on those inconvenient problems, which are in fact the only problems that matter. But the payout for them is the greatest. Whether the measure of success is, for the realists, global security and things like that, or greater human rights, we could very well end up with both. I think if we continue investing in women and girls in Afghanistan in the short run, we'll see those great payouts in the long run.
Lauren, you mentioned a bunch of really critical questions that affect policymakers, decision makers directly. So let me push you a little bit further. When you say we need to come up with some creative solutions to support Afghan women, one of the hard problems that governments around the world are contending with is, how do you do that without strengthening the Taliban regime? How do you provide assistance to ordinary people that are dealing with drought, famine, massive shortages of medical supplies, and profound neglect? In your mind, where would the beginning be for some of those thorny issues in terms of trying to address them creatively?
Yeah, that's an important question, and certainly we have to do things differently than we did before August. But on the other hand, today Afghanistan is not isolated the way it was under the first Taliban regime, where it was it was so cut off from the rest of the world. I mean, when I first went there, I had to bring the satellite phone that was, the size of a fax machine in my luggage to be able to make a phone call, because the phone systems didn't work, let alone internet or things like that. It's totally different now. I am talking every single day to Afghans in Afghanistan, by email, by chat, by mobile phone. So there's an interconnectedness there wasn't before, and there's an integration with the region there wasn't before. So we can take advantage of that. So one, very practical example is set up cohorts at universities in the region where women can go to study. If they can't access education in Afghanistan, support them to access it outside of Afghanistan. If we can't take more than the 40,000 we've committed to, and it looks like we're really struggling to even get those 40,000, look at the region for solutions. Have partnerships with universities in places like India, Turkey, Kazakhstan, or elsewhere, involve Canadian universities in that. And I think there's all kinds of other programs in other sectors beyond higher education, where you can use that approach, where you can get girls out, women out, and participate in programs funded by Canada in the region. And then inside Afghanistan, it is still possible to implement programs where you bypass the government and work with the government. So there's the US model of their licensing exemption system, where they're still allowing some development and humanitarian programming to continue, where there's no collaboration or resources going to the Taliban. And then I think we also need to support programs that address the economic crisis and the fact that millions of people have lost their jobs since August, including millions of women, and people are struggling to feed their families. We could do very practical things like give incentives to employers in Canada to hire Afghans to work remotely. Afghanistan is filled with talent. You have, software developers, graphic designers, people who can do all kinds of things, and they need work, and they can work from where they are. And that would make a big difference. And that's something we could do in collaboration with the private sector. Looking to the role of people like Anisa, all the talent that's now outside of Afghanistan, continuing to support them. For instance, having a media in exile. So there's still some degree of the free flow of information, because Afghanistan is more interconnected now. People can still access the news from outside. So if they won't get the free press inside Afghanistan, help bolster the free press outside of Afghanistan.
These are incredible ideas, Lauren, and I thank you for them. Most people define the problem and don't present a solution. You've done that on education, economic, health, and civil society outcomes in one clean swoop, which makes you wonder sometimes, why don't officials at foreign affairs departments around the world just do those things? Those are reasonable, practicable, not cost-intensive ideas, and excellent proposals. So thank you very much, Lauren, for pushing yourself and for pushing us to think about the creative solutions that can work. Anisa, I'd like to turn to you now, because as a longtime journalist in Afghanistan, as somebody who has covered corruption, drug problems, social problems, the geopolitics of Afghanistan's neighbors, I'd love to ask you this question, looking at your country now. Who do you think is most responsible for the situation that Afghans are encountering? Is it corruption? Is it neighboring countries? Is it been how the West has engaged ordinary Afghans over the last decade? What do you think is why there are so many problems? And I think you're on mute. Because it's 2022, right, Anisa?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Afghanistan situation, the politician is on this situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The international politician, because corruption just is one point. and all situation in Afghanistan just about politician, international politician about, I think. And when I'm told talk about women, it's very hard for me because Afghanistan women and Afghanistan people in a very bad situation now. I want to say that people have always been victims of politics governments and non-government activist churches slogan in support of women and Afghan people, but did nothing for Afghanistan people. Board left alone Afghanistan people. Politician.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. I think that's an incredibly important point you made, Anisa, that it's the politicians
Yes.
internationally, and let me make sure I have it right, and Afghan politicians
Yes.
who
No,
put
just one politician. No. World politician.
world politicians.
Yes.
And do you
Afghan people victim about the world politician.
And you think that for the international community, the leaders in the world,
Yeah.
do you think that they did not listen to the Afghan people as much as they should have? Did the Afghan people have good representatives as well?
I don't understand.
That's okay. Let me try again. Do you think that when international politicians were thinking about Afghanistan, did they
No.
listen to the people?
I think world politician not think about Afghanistan. Afghanistan people alone. Afghanistan people is a politician. I think American politician and Western politician, all of Afghanistan forgot. Now forgot. I don't know why. The international community want to Afghanistan 20 years ago fight terrorism and world democracy, creating a free Afghanistan in which men and women have equal rights. And now, where is the Afghanistan that the world make to create for 20 years ago? Where?
It's a powerful question. Thank you, Anisa. And let me turn to you, Khurshid, on this because I think it aligns with what your opening commentary had initially started, which was the West and its international politicians tended not to listen to the priorities of Afghans. And if you listen to Anisa today, you realize they just left. They disappeared. they didn't maintain their commitment. Their words didn't matter. And that's what's on the line, is the integrity that so many democratic countries around the world have to contend with. This is the gap between what they said and what they did, and the price the Afghan people are paying for that. So let me ask you, Khurshid, when you hear Anisa and you think about the vantage points you've had of Afghanistan as a journalist, as part of being in service of your country's diplomacy, as an activist today, having seen kind of the perspective of what Western politicians have done, what did Western politicians get wrong over the last 10, 15 years when they engaged the Afghan government and the Afghan people?
That is a very, very incredible question, too. I'm not sure that I have the answers, but I have some insight. I think you're asked, just to reiterate, where has it gone wrong the last 10 years? Is that kind of where you want, or what were the mistakes that were made?
From the perspective of Western politicians, what was the information that they were hearing that was not right? What were they listening to? Were they listening to the right issues? Were they listening to the right problems? How did the West process information in such a way that it resulted in these policy decisions and these policy choices?
Okay, so thank you for clarifying that a little bit more.
Sure. Sorry for being more clear.
I think that there were lots of different sources of information coming to the West, from voices on the ground, and also from our regional partners that were influenced by their own agendas, and they were bringing in misinformation, basically trying to turn Afghanistan or let the West think that everything was rosy. For a period of time, things were definitely moving in the right direction. But I would say over the last 8 years before the West withdrew its presence, the security situation started unraveling. And even though there were some victories here and there, I don't think that the West was willing to admit that the so quote unquote war was unwinnable. And the way they went about it was incorrect because they were looking at it more from a military perspective versus really working with more of the communities and building um, infrastructure and projects from the ground up across the country instead of just in the urban centers. And or another issue that I saw was that there were all of these foreign entities and NGOs and so on and so forth, where all the money that was pumped in, the billions of dollars, was going back into their coffers, but not really going to build a sustainable economy, a sustainable form of education. There were, sustainable economic projects. There were great examples of growth and change, but they were not sustainable enough because I think in the West, they were losing patience. There's this almost, snap your fingers, it has to be done, press a button, and flip a switch. And if it's not working after that period of time, if they're not seeing a return on the investment, I think the interest started to die down. And there was irritation and impatience that was starting to percolate in the Western governments. But I think that unfortunately, the level of corruption that occurred, that still occurs, but occurred in the Afghan government and throughout the society, kind of systemic. On some level, it's very understandable because it's such a poor country, and a lot of people don't know where their next meal may come from. But then they see that corruption is also existing and taking place on a much higher level. So they're like, oh, well, if it's happening there in the seat of power, then I better take care of myself and my family. But our neighbors, unfortunately, the geopolitical mess has ensnared Afghanistan. It continues to ensnare Afghanistan. It has for 40 years with our neighbors like Pakistan and Iran and Saudi Arabia's influence. And then the West not really being honest about that influence and not really taking the bull by the horns and understanding the complexity of Afghanistan's situation and location in the world. And I think a lot of it also is that the West was not as educated about that history and about those complexities because it's so multi-layered and it's so complex to understand where a lot of these influences are coming in. So I think it boils down to the mess of politics, impatience, and wanting to see things change more quickly than a quick fix versus the long-term types of solutions. Although 20 years is a long time, but I think that the way the West has gone about this, they should have really built up the communities and built up the country with sustainable development and economic development, and really empowered. Yes, they helped empower a lot of Afghan women and bring these, more freedoms and help protect and build up and encourage civil society and human rights. But ultimately, it comes down to mindsets, and it comes down to cultural belief systems, and it comes down to education across the board, and our neighbors who interfered and continue to interfere, which has led to where we are. It's just a lot of different. You can't just point to one reason. There are multiple reasons why Afghanistan is where it's at today.
Thank you for that. And I think that's you did a really great job for a question I just put you on the spot for, so I appreciate it. And I think about, if we're going to try and find ways to solve the problem and to be meaningfully helpful to Afghans, I agree that we need to be humble about the last 20 years. As you're describing the situation, Khurshid, I was thinking about what H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor of the United States, recently defined the Afghan issue as. And he said that the West waged 21-year wars, not one 20-year effort. And when I think about the fundamental structural approaches that the West had started back in 2001, 2002, we're in a different world. We've learned a lot. We should be humbled to hear it. But the idea of working at the grassroots in countries to build long-term resilience rather than purely engaging the elite actors in the capitals or the big urban centers. The idea that corruption of the elite can enable corruption at the grassroots, which is the most frustrating variety and what drives the gap between confidence between citizens and their governments. And the idea that we be realistic about the aspirations of neighbors, whether they are good actors or bad actors, and how to actually hold them accountable. It's a masterclass, Khurshid, that you just described, the issues that we can learn and apply to Afghanistan's future. Which brings me to Lauren, who was there at the Loya Jirga at the beginning of this 20 years ago. Let me ask you, Lauren, when you look at what we must do in those types of categories, because you've already provided some excellent solutions for what we can do to support the Afghan women today. But when you think of engaging the questions of the neighborhood, really understanding the realities of who could be partners and who couldn't be, you began the process of articulating a few that could be constructive relationships. How would you, it's a game I like to play. If you're sitting in the office with the Prime Minister of Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, alongside Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, Defense Minister Anita Anand, and you have an opportunity to brief them to say, listen, the priorities of Canada in dealing with the Afghanistan issue are this. What would you say those are?
Yeah, that's a big question and a great question. And I think firstly, I would ask for moral courage, that first get some criteria down before getting into specific policies, and be willing to do things that other countries haven't done, that our own country hasn't done before, and that are the right things to do, and not necessarily the expedient things to do, and be really truly rights focused, and as I said, creative. But I think, to be honest, I think it won't happen until we demand it to happen. And I mean, we as in the public. And the beauty of living in a democracy, unlike in Afghanistan or in Russia, for instance, is that we can communicate to our elected officials, and we can pressure them through all kinds of means. We can directly reach them. We can use the media. So, and I think there is a response to that, but we have to ask for it. And one of the really long-term trends I'm seeing is this retreat from internationalism, and it has had a huge consequence for Afghanistan and our willingness to engage in other places on these hard problems I talked about earlier, and to see it as our business. And so I think first, at the level of the public, at the level of our society, our culture, we have to fix that if we want it to be reflected in our policies and in the behavior of our political leaders. And I, at a micro level, I see this in feminism in the West, that there's this insularity that we're willing to be progressive in what we call for domestically, but we don't apply that beyond our borders, and we can be extremely tribal in our feminism. And it's ironic that we think this is progressive, and it's actually really, really regressive. So first, we have to get internationalist in our mindset. And that means we have to be universal about it. We can't just be internationalist when we're watching the news about Ukraine. We have to be internationalist when we're watching what's happening to Afghans and see that these are human beings exactly like us. And the pain they feel is exactly what we would feel if we were in their shoes. And then we have to ask our politicians to see it the same way. So I don't know that I on my own could make a difference in, sitting in a room with the cabinet. I was sure as hell try, but we need the public with us too, putting that pressure on them, and then they will act accordingly. So this is kind of a longer term project where we have to re-embrace internationalism. And maybe Ukraine is an opportunity to do that, but we're going to have to be really consistently calling for more. A very practical example of this is in the past 2 weeks, over and over, I'm sure everyone has seen these statements of solidarity coming out of institutions across Canada. The universities where I teach, they issued one quite promptly. And we didn't see it with Afghanistan. And I kept scratching my head, looking at organizations that work on things like education, human rights, gender. I mean, they should be speaking out about these issues in the world. But I think, again, it comes down to this retreat from internationalism. So I think that we have to learn how to be internationalists again and ask our government to do so accordingly and have bold foreign policy and be willing to take risks and experiment and try new things that respond to the problem at hand and not the situation how it was before. And we can do it. Within 15 days, Canada had changed the law to facilitate sanctions on Russia. So they used the Special Economic Measures Act, and they had new legislation. So we can move really quickly when we're motivated to do so. But I think we have to help government find that motivation when it comes to Afghanistan.
Khurshid, I see you have a comment to make.
I just want to, I know we're almost running out of time here, but I think what Lauren said is so important right now, and that we need to re-engage with our internationalism. But I think that there's something else going on here, and we haven't talked about it, and I don't think we'll have a lot of time to talk about it, but it's racism and bigotry. And I just want to read very quickly. The Irish MP, her name is Claire Daly, she called it out perfectly yesterday, I believe it was, or on International Women's Day. She said, "Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, tens of thousands seeking refuge, 5 million children facing famine, 500% increase in child marriages, children being sold to feed their families, but not a mention of it. No wall-to-wall TV coverage, no emergency humanitarian response. My God, they must be wondering what makes their humanitarian crisis so unimportant. Is it the color of their skin? Is it that they're not white? That they're not European?"
Powerful comments, powerful indictment. And I think it actually meets what Lauren described as a need for consistency in how we confront challenges in different parts of the world that have very similar DNA. And being able to step up as a democratic world in a way that responds to modern pressures requires us to see people for who they are and to serve them to the best of our ability. I'll give you both a quick moment. I noticed that Anisa seems to be having some technical issues, so I'd love to give you both just a few minutes to say any concluding comments you might want to get across before we conclude this amazing and fascinating discussion that you've provided us with. Lauren, I'll turn to you real quick. If you've got any closing thoughts, now would be the best time for them.
Yeah, I guess, the only thing I didn't really have a chance to say that I think is important, I talked about development interventions and foreign policy writ large, but I think in our diplomacy, we also need these same things. We need to be bold. We need to be internationalist. And at some point, I think there needs to be a reckoning for, what happened, not in August, but the events that preceded it, that started in 2020 when the bilateral agreement was signed between the United States and the Taliban. And Canada was, of course, not a party to that agreement, nor was the Afghan government, although they were certainly subject to the consequences, and the people were more than any party. But we kind of went along with it. I mean, we were there in the country. We're part of the coalition with the U.S. and other countries. And I think there is a kind of hierarchy of responsibility, and we're somewhere in that hierarchy. And so, you know, when the dust settles a bit and the resettlement of those 40,000 Afghans is achieved, and we've got some decent policy for meeting the needs of women and girls in Afghanistan, the left behind, I think we have to take a look at what went wrong there, so that we never do it again in any other country. We never sign an agreement with the devil that actually sells a whole population down the river. We would not be in the situation that Afghanistan is in now if that didn't happen. It was that moment in 2020 where the Taliban got emboldened and where they realized we could actually seize power. And they had this facade of being part of peace talks for those 2 years, all the while that they were attacking civilians and blowing things up and carrying on terrorism. That was so obvious to everyone that they were not serious about peace talks. And we should have seen that as a strong clue that they were just going to violently seize power anyways. And this was all for naught. But there was complicity from the West in that. And at some point, I think we have to do some really serious reflection on how we got to the stage, and with the intent that we never let this repeat itself anywhere else.
It's an excellent point, and we'll do that in common cause. We'll do it together. Khurshid, final comments to you.
Oh, I just really appreciate what Lauren just said. So yes, there's complicity, and there are mistakes strewn like bones across the desert in every direction. And so I really do hope that we are able to have that opportunity to study and learn from those mistakes. But right now, we do have to get the world to re-engage and to turn the focus back to Afghanistan. I don't know that it's going to happen overnight because of what's happening in Ukraine, but we cannot give up hope. We cannot become soft and accept this as inevitable. I think that when we do start re-engaging and turning back to helping Afghanistan, we still have to not compromise with the Taliban when it comes to girls' education. This ban on girls' education, which is going on now with 175 days or what have you, almost 7 months or what have you, they've said that they may open the schools again on March 22nd. We have to wait and see what that might look like. But there should be no compromise with them over education for girls and higher education for young women. And that any types of funds, humanitarian funds, have to be tied to that. That's the only place that we have some kind of power left when it comes to opening the purse strings to the Taliban. While they remain in power, we do have to keep our eye on the prize, which is education and human rights, civil liberties for women and girls. Otherwise, it's just an ongoing catastrophe.
Thank you very much. Let me conclude our conversation today by, first of all, thanking Anisa Shaheed, a brave journalist from Tolo News who has much more work to do in connecting with her colleagues around the world and continuing her effort to reflect the realities of Afghan stories to the world and to Afghans themselves. I'm very grateful she was able to join us, and we'll have a chance to relate that later on. Let me also extend the regrets of Yelda Hakim, BBC presenter, who is presently in Ukraine covering the war zone story, while she continues to tweet online about the plight of Afghan girls and women who have been deprived of the education that Khurshid just described. So we thank her for being willing to join, but wasn't able to connect today. We'll have a chance to circle back with her. Most importantly, let me thank Lauren Oates and Khurshid Nusrati for their singular leadership, their partnership, the great comments that they provided today to not just describe so empathetically the frustrations that they feel and they know are true for Afghanistan, not just for being able to define some solutions. Oh, there we have Anisa. Anisa, I was just you.
Yeah, I don't know why my internet is done.
Well, listen, I was just wrapping up, but let me pause that wrap up and turn to you. Do you have any final comments that you wanted to share with our audience today about Afghan and Afghan people?
Yes, I just
Thank you.
one a short comment.
Please.
On these days, politicians send a good message for Afghan people, especially for Afghan women. And but I say, if you want to help Afghanistan people, you have to look at the changing situation in Afghanistan. When there is no government in Afghanistan, people do not have a human right and good life. I am disappointed with help of the international community to Afghan women, Afghan people. But it's my wish that Afghanistan people have a human life. Just this. Thank you.
I have nothing else to add. I think, Anisa Jan, you did a wonderful job at concluding our conversation today with exactly what we would love to leave the audience with. So let me thank you all once again. Anisa Jan, thank you very much. Khurshid Jan, thank you very much. Lauren Jan, thank you very much. And to viewers who've tuned in today, stay engaged on this issue. Let me conclude by suggesting if the world seems a bit more disrupted and more disordered, it's because it is. There is a gap between how the West has conducted itself, how democracies conduct themselves in defining a common understanding of the threat. And I think what we're seeing between Afghanistan and Ukraine is an awakening in the West, if I could be optimistic about it, that once again we can restore the idea of peace through strength, of identifying authoritarian challenges for who they are and being consistent in how we confront them, and then allying our interests with our values, which is with the people of places like Afghanistan, the most vulnerable, the most persecuted, in understanding that where human dignity is imperiled, where human freedom is diminished, ultimately is our opportunity to partner with those who can help shape a more peaceful, more prosperous world. So thank you very much for joining us on this International Women's Day seminar on how the West has evacuated the land but must not abandon the women of Afghanistan. I'm Shuvaloy Majumdar with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Stay in touch, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you all very, very much for this.
Thank you.